Today, we're previewing a remarkable series of podcasts to come, each one dedicated to a different region of the ancient world, each one promising to rewrite what we thought we knew about human history.
The foundation of everything in this series is what the author describes as an iconographic writing system, one that was recently deciphered and is covered in detail in other podcasts in the FreeBC series. What makes it particularly unusual is that this writing system was based, at least in part, on cartography. So ancient maps were embedded within the iconography, which means that when the author looks at something like a mythological figure or a cave painting, they're not just seeing art or legend, they're reading a historical document.
So mythology as history, that's the central claim.
Precisely. And the preview makes that explicit. The author says we can now read ancient mythology as histories. Full stop. That's the lens through which every episode in this series is going to operate.
That is a significant claim, and I imagine it's going to ruffle quite a few academic feathers along the way.
The author is rather upfront about that, actually. There's a line in the preview where they acknowledge their nomenclature will ruffle a lot of feathers, but the position is essentially the maps cannot lie. So let's start with the Americas, because that's where the preview begins, and it's immediately striking.
Yes, because the conventional story of how people arrived in the Americas is already contested, but the preview takes it somewhere quite different.
It does. The iconographic record, according to the author, reveals that the first Americans did not arrive a few thousand years ago, and they were not limited to a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. The preview describes the earliest Americans following a coastal route to what is today British Columbia.
And the leader of that first expedition, this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, is identified as the Raven.
Yes, the Raven, remembered in Tlingit lore as the Raven Trickster. The preview says the Raven spoke all subsequent kingdoms of the north into existence, from the Orca to the Thunderbird, all the way down the generations to Changing Woman. So these are not just myths. The author is reading them as a dynastic record.
That reframing of indigenous oral tradition as dynastic history is going to be one of the more provocative threads in that episode, I'd imagine.
Almost certainly. But then the preview adds another layer entirely, a second expedition, and this one is extraordinary. The son of a king in the Philippines embarks on what the author calls the most daring expedition of all time, a direct crossing of the Pacific.
On floating islands made of bamboo pontoons.
Exactly. The preview describes the first fleet to navigate using the Pacific countercurrent, floating for nearly 4 months before landing on the west coast of what is today Ecuador. And then, and this is where it gets even more layered, the author suggests there may have been an even earlier expedition launched from Polynesia that landed at Tierra del Fuego.
So potentially 3 separate founding expeditions to the Americas, each from a different origin point.
That's the suggestion, yes. And the reason the Tierra del Fuego expedition remained unknown, according to the preview, is that those mariners simply never found a way back to Indonesia to spread word of their success. They arrived, they settled, and the knowledge of that journey was lost.
There's something almost melancholy about that, isn't there? A successful crossing of the world, and no one ever knew.
It is, and the Americas episode promises to follow the maps as they reveal one kingdom after the next, in a westward progress that reaches all the way to the east coast of Canada and the United States, and possibly as far as Greenland. At which point the series turns to witness Europeans discovering and then colonizing the Americas.
So the Americas episode alone is essentially a complete rewriting of pre-Columbian history. Let's move to Arabia and Africa, because the preview makes some of its boldest claims there.
It does, and the timescales involved are staggering. The author states that the iconographic record in Arabia and Africa is far more ancient than anyone realizes. The key claim is that Arabia and Anatolia can be identified as a single contiguous realm as early as 60,000 BC.
60,000 BC. That's well before anything in the conventional archaeological record for organized civilization.
And the author acknowledges that date is likely to be pushed back even further as more of the iconographic record is decoded. The key iconograph defining this archaic realm, according to the preview, is a star thistle, because that flower most closely resembled the geometry of the Euphrates and Tigris catchment when documented in cartography.
So a flower becomes a map, becomes a civilizational identifier. That's the logic of the system.
Precisely. And then the preview moves to what it calls Arabia's Age of Restoration, the first expedition to reclaim the Euphrates and Tigris after the Toba eruption. The author identifies this expedition with the biblical Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives, settling on the slopes of Mount Ararat in the headwaters of the Euphrates.
And the author's position is that this is not myth.
Explicitly so. The preview says, and I'm quoting here, "We may now be confident this is no myth because they left maps behind." That's the author's evidentiary standard throughout. The maps are the proof.
And alongside Noah's line, a figure called Nefertum is identified as founding a realm that would eventually encompass the entire continent of Africa.
Yes. The preview describes Arabia being circumnavigated within a generation, the Nile Delta discovered, and the headwaters of the Nile reached and claimed by a prince named Nefertum. 2 realms founded in tandem, one on the Euphrates, one on the Nile. Noah's line in Arabia, Nefertum's line in Africa. And the author promises the entire Egyptian pantheon will come to life in that episode.
Now, the preview also uses the Arabia and Africa section to mount a direct challenge to the Out of Africa narrative. And the author is quite pointed about it.
Very pointed. The author calls it a racist trope and rests the challenge on 2 datasets. The first is genetic research establishing that the human genome has been present on Earth for around 6 million years. The problem, as the author frames it, is that archaeology only goes back to around 3.2 million years because everyone has been looking in Africa.
So there's a gap of 2.8 million years in the archaeological record.
2.8 million years of missing links, as the preview puts it. And the author's second dataset is the iconographic record itself. The maps all originate in Indonesia and radiate outward in all directions from Borneo. The author's conclusion is that when archaeology stops looking exclusively in Africa, the cradle of humanity will be found in Papua New Guinea and Australia.
That is a genuinely bold staking of a career. The author says as much in the preview.
They do. The exact phrase is, "I won't stake my life on it, but I have staked my career on it." And the author's preferred formulation is not out of Africa, but in and out of Africa, acknowledging Africa's role while insisting it was not the sole origin point.
Let's move to Anatolia and Macedonia, which the author groups together under the term Greater Macedonia. And again, the Toba supereruption is central.
It is. The Toba eruption is essentially the catastrophic event around which much of this series is organized, the great disruption that forced the repopulation of the ancient world. The preview describes Anatolia and Greater Macedonia as a direct familial corridor of repopulation following that eruption.
And the Caucasus emerges as a kind of administrative center for this ancient world.
Yes, the preview describes the Caucasus as the home dominion of what it calls the sovereign father and mother in the Archaic period, with the Black Sea as their frontier domain. All river kingdoms established on rivers flowing into the Black Sea are said to originate in an arbitrated process governed from what is today Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia.
And the author connects this to the Venus of Willendorf, of all things.
Which is one of the more arresting claims in the preview. The Venus of Willendorf, that famous prehistoric figurine, is interpreted not as a fertility symbol in the conventional sense, but as cartography. The author says the female figure documents Greater Macedonia, and that's why the term is used for the region.
So a 30,000-year-old statuette is actually a map. That is going to be a remarkable episode to hear in full.
I think so. And the author is candid that the nomenclature will be contested, but the position is, until someone proves the map's wrong, the attribution stands.
Now, Occitania and Iberia, and here the preview gets into some very specific archaeological evidence. Dates, artifacts, cave paintings.
This is where the iconographic record becomes most tangible, in a sense, because we're talking about physical objects with radiocarbon dates. The preview highlights a bone carving dated to 12,400 BC that records the contours of several valley systems in the Pyrenees Mountains. And then there are the cave paintings, dominated by the megafauna of the Upper Paleolithic.
And the author's reading of those paintings is that many of them are maps.
Many are maps, most are not. That's the careful distinction the author draws. And the author is equally careful to note they haven't conducted fieldwork on the caves, so they brevade from offering a full opinion there. But what they have determined is that Occitania, the realm north of Iberia, on the other side of the Pyrenees, was documented as a bison in the iconographic system.
And the Occitanian cartography is dated to 17,000 BC.
17,000 BC, yes. And perhaps most striking, the author says that in just 2 artifacts, they documented all of modern Spain and Portugal and all of what is modern France. 2 objects, the entire Iberian Peninsula and France.
That density of information in a single artifact it's almost hard to conceptualize.
It is. And the author admits they couldn't help themselves. They kept going even after they had what they needed. There's a kind of infectious enthusiasm in the preview that I think will carry through the episodes themselves.
Now we come to what is perhaps the most personally significant section for the author, the British Isles, which they call Yggdrasil in the Archaic. And this is where the bulk of their in-depth research was conducted.
The author describes it as their most controversial attribution. The British Isles are represented in the iconographic system by an oak tree, which is why the name Yggdrasil is invoked. And the reason for that specific invocation is the presence within pre-Roman British iconography of figures like Nörherger, Fafnir, Jörmungandr, and Fenrir the wolf.
These are figures we associate entirely with Norse mythology, with Scandinavia.
Exactly, and that's the provocation. The author's argument is that these figures appear in pre-Roman British iconography and nowhere else in that form. Most scholars attribute the Norse sagas to Iceland, but the preview argues that the first Icelanders were Viking men who had settled in Britain and taken British brides.
And it was the mothers who kept the lore.
That's the key insight. The preview states, and this is a line worth sitting with, mothers, not fathers, in all ages prior to the printing press, were the lawmasters, the keepers of the family history. So the Icelandic sagas are, in the author's reading, echoes of narratives maintained by Britons in pre-Roman times, carried north by women.
And the reason those narratives left Britain is also explained in the preview. The Christianization of Britain effectively severed the connection to the old iconographic system.
Yes. The preview describes Britain's nobility choosing to let go of their iconographic writing system and its legendaria as part of putting the dark centuries of what it calls Caesarean apartheid behind them. The men who wanted to continue in devotion to the old ways, the so-called Vikings, were irreconcilable, and Iceland was seen as a promising land, so they sailed north with their British brides.
And on the word Viking itself, the preview makes a point of clarifying what it actually means.
It does. Viking is described as an exononym, meaning it was a name given by others, not a self-description, and it means raiders or invaders, so nobody was ever actually a Viking in the sense of identifying as one. And the author's conclusion from the iconographic record is that all Scandinavian kingdoms, with the Danemark being first, derive from pre-Roman British roots.
That is going to be a genuinely contentious episode. Right, Nordigeca, Scandinavia, and the Baltic nations. And this one has a very specific starting point, the ice.
The entire region was under 3 kilometers of glacial ice until around 9,300 BC. That's the author's explanation for why Nordigica was the last place on Earth to be recolonized following the Toba supereruption. There was simply nowhere to go until the ice retreated.
And then the preview takes a rather pointed turn toward Nazi mythology.
Quite deliberately so. The author promises that in the Nordica episode, one Nazi myth after another will topple in favor of the truth. The preview mentions identifying the true island from which all Deutsch peoples originate, with a spoiler that it isn't Atlantis. Then there's the claim about the German shepherd, which the author says was originally a Great Dane.
And then the Totenkopf, the death's head symbol.
The author says it has nothing to do with the end of life whatsoever and everything to do with the beginning of life, which is a complete inversion of how it's been understood. But the centerpiece of the Nordiga episode, it seems, will be the etymology of the word Aryan.
And the author's position on that is unambiguous.
Completely unambiguous. Aryan is a Sanskrit word meaning civilized. It's an adjective. And the author makes the point with some force, you cannot be descended from an adjective, only a noun. There has never been an Aryan race in the sense of a proper noun. And the author adds that if there is one thing for which the Nazis could never be mistaken, it is civilized.
That line lands rather hard.
It does. And the author takes no pride in the reveal. The preview says there is only shame in it, because all of this could and should have been known if accredited academia had been doing its job in 1933.
Which brings us to the final section of the preview and the author's reframing of what we call the Roman Empire.
This is where the author is perhaps most insistent on a change of language. The preview states flatly that the term Roman Empire must be replaced in history books with Caesarian apartheid, because that, the author argues, is precisely what it was.
And the distinction between Caesar and Rome is central to that argument.
Absolutely central. The preview makes the point that Rome tried to overthrow Caesar on more than one occasion. Rome and Caesar were not the same thing, and Rome eventually won, replacing the perennial dictator, in the author's words, with the carpenter's son he tried to murder.
So the rise of Christianity in this reading is partly Rome's victory over Caesar.
That's the implication, yes. It's a reframing that connects the political history of Rome to the religious history of the West in a way that I don't think many people will have encountered before.
So when you step back from all of this, from the Raven landing on the shores of Alaska, to bamboo pontoons crossing the Pacific, to Noah's maps on Mount Ararat, to the Venus of Willendorf as a cartographic document, to British mothers preserving Norse sagas, to the Sanskrit roots of a word that was used to justify genocide, what strikes you most about the shape of this series?
What strikes me is the coherence of it. Each episode is discrete, a different region, a different period, but they're all built on the same evidentiary foundation, the iconographic writing system and the maps embedded within it. The author is not making separate arguments in each episode. They're unfolding a single, continuous argument about human history from a single, consistent methodology.
And the methodology itself, reading mythology as history through cartographic iconography, is the thing that either makes all of this extraordinary or makes it the most ambitious reinterpretation of the ancient world anyone has attempted in a very long time.
Possibly both. The author is not asking listeners to simply take their word for it. The maps are presented as the evidence.
I hope you enjoyed this FreeBC preview. Look for new episodes to drop in the coming months.